Sick societies don't produce young men like Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, who placed his body between mine and the man with the gun simply because he felt that's what his duty called for him to do. Sick societies don't produce dedicated police officers like Tom Delahanty. Sick societies don't make people like us so proud to be Americans and so very proud of our fellow citizens.
Then President Ronald Reagan, less than a month after he was shot and nearly killed by a gunman in Washington, D.C. GOP nominee Donald Trump has signaled he will call for unity ahead of his speech at the RNC on Thursday after surviving his own assassination attempt over the weekend. More than a century earlier, then former President Teddy Roosevelt, who was shot while campaigning to retake the White House, cooled down his rhetoric in a hard-fought campaign after the attempt on his life. So too did Alabama Governor George Wallace, who survived being shot 5 times in 1972 when he was running for president, and would go on to apologize for his long history of racism.
Let's bring in right now Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris, there's so many things we need to talk about. I want to start though with TR because you looked at what happened with Donald Trump, who got shot, and then, despite the fact the Secret Service should have held his head down and got him off stage, he still stood up and made the gestures to the crowd, told me it was okay, raised his fist. It does remind you of TR getting shot and continuing his speech.
You're absolutely right, Joe. It does. I mean, what happened to TR was he was shot standing up in a car right outside of the hotel on his way to deliver a speech, right in the chest, point blank. He was shot. And they insisted, the doctors, that he go to the hospital. He said, no, I'm going to give the speech. So he goes to give the speech. He stands on that stage with the bullet in his chest. 64 minutes. 84 minutes he speaks in that speech. They come up to the stage several times. You've got to get off. Your breath is going. He said, no, I have to finish. He finally finished his speech. And the thing they realized was, they only realized he hadn't been killed because his speech was so thick, it was in his pocket, and his spectacles were there, that it didn't deflect into his heart. Incredibly, right? So he goes to the hospital. He has to stay there for some time to the infection. But when he comes out, he does change. I mean, he does, as you say, he got rid of the invective that he'd been using. He'd been name-calling. He gave one of the best speeches, and it looked like the empathy of the country was going to go for him. In fact, one of the Democrats said, the bullet that rests in Teddy Roosevelt's chest has now killed Wilson, the Democrats' chance for the election. But in fact, the fundamentals remain the same. He was a former president running against Taft, his former friend, in the Republican Party. The Republican Party was split, so the Democrats won, but he won the largest ever third-party candidate because he was able to deal with that election and that assassination attempt in the most perfect tonal way.
Well, every biographer of Republican Ronald Reagan seemed to also talk about how he changed after he got shot. And Reagan, who was considered to be the coldest of Cold War warriors, Reagan believed that God had a hand in his life being saved. And didn't he talk about, from that point forward, his goal was to bring about an end of a nuclear escalation and to prevent Armageddon?
I think you're right, Joe. When you come up against your mortality, as certainly Reagan did, it makes you reflect and think about, how do I want to be remembered? What do I want to do with the rest of my term? I mean, even in that month when he went to the joint session of Congress from that speech, that was the perfect tone, right, for him to believe in the optimism of America, to talk about this as not a sick society. How can it be when all these people have done such heroic things? And then what he did was to introduce his his legislative package, his tax bill, which had not been going very well before the assassination attempt. But now there was such an overwhelming approval for him. It went up to 68% after that assassination attack, higher than it would ever go. And he was able to get that bill through the Congress. So he was able to move forward, which I think is what the country wanted. And then, as you say, later on, move forward much more on his international beliefs.
We've talked about positive outcomes from these tragic events. Let's talk about also negative outcomes. I still am a very strong belief, and you obviously you lived this too close and too personally, but it was a very strong belief that America never recovered from what happened on November 22nd, 1963. You talk about two Americas. That is a dividing line, unlike hardly in others. And I don't know that the Democratic Party ever really recovered from June 6th, 1968, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. What are your thoughts?
Well, what you realize in the 1960s, where I've just been living again in my mind in terms of my new book, you were numbed almost. You had John Kennedy's assassination. You had Martin Luther King's assassination. You had Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Malcolm X. It was a period of time when so much was following upon each other. But I do think we did recover in one sense. I mean, Lyndon Johnson went to a joint session of Congress only 4 days after the funeral, and he said, let us move forward. And he armored himself in all the admiration that was there for John Kennedy. He said nothing would matter more than the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and indeed his entire legislative program. JFK's legislative program was stuck in the Congress. People were talking about a broken Congress in gridlock, and he got almost all of those bills through, and it made people feel we were moving forward. At the same time, when you think about Wallace, as you mentioned at the beginning, there was a change for the positive. He had been the arch segregationist. He got shot in the stomach in 1972 campaigning for the presidency. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Again, he came up against his mortality, had time to reflect, and he turned against his old self. He truly changed. He went before the black community. He took responsibility for all his segregation comments. He went to the black churches. He ran for governor again, and he won 90% of the black vote, and then had a good presidency, a good governorship for the black people. He put more people into his administration. He doubled the number of black registration votes. And somehow even John Lewis at the end was able, when he died, to put for Wallace's death, saying he had become a changed man. I may never forget what he did when he talked about segregation, but I forgive. That's what the civil rights movement is all about. It's about love and justice and forgiveness. So that's a positive thing. So certainly positive things came out of these if the tone is right and the people move forward. And that's what we saw Reagan do. That's what we saw JFK do. And that's what we saw George Wallace do as well. So we can take, I think, some solace and hope from that. Maybe the president will be a maybe the president will be a changed man. He's talked about the fact it changed him. We'll have to just wait and see what happens in these days and months ahead.
Presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you very much. Her book, An Unfinished Love Story, a personal history of the 1960s, is out now.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.